Tiny Tina's Wonderlands has been out for a couple of months now, and a lot of people seem to have given up on it entirely. And while I understand that, it also definitely puts a lot of people off that might have picked up the game had they not seen so many negative things about it. It's kinda hard to get a solid answer in the middle of all this criticism. Hey everyone, I'm Constant Canadian, and this is Tiny Tina's Wonderlands worth $80 Canadian? Before we get into the video, I want to know what your favorite Borderlands game is and why. Let me know in the comments down below, and be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoy the video. One of the most important factors for enjoyment of a game for me is the story. Case in point, most of Borderlands 3's hate came specifically from the story. However, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands has one of the best stories in all of the franchise. There are so many amazing moments in the story, and it has the perfect amount of action and adventure. Playing through the story of Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is one of the best parts of the game in my opinion. Despite the problems of Wonderlands, its story never disappoints. I know a lot of people actually don't care for the story, but especially for me, a good story is absolutely crucial for the replayability of a game. And that's an aspect that Tiny Tina's Wonderlands gets right. The DLC of Wonderlands is definitely where a lot of the controversy comes from. Wonderlands' DLC has been horrendously disappointing, which is super out of character for Gearbox. The DLCs from previous titles were absolutely breathtaking. They were different from the main game while still giving that Borderlands feel. Certain DLCs were even good enough to warrant being made into their own game, like Tiny Tina's Attack on Dragonkeep for example, and even the pre-sequel was originally a DLC for Borderlands 2. The DLC for Wonderlands, on the other hand, has been kind of bad. For those of you who don't know, the endgame in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is essentially just an endless, randomly generated dungeon that the player runs through over and over. The two DLCs we have gotten for Wonderlands so far have been essentially that, just 5 or 6 room dungeons that the player is meant to run over and over, albeit with a little bit of extra loot to get as well. This is incredibly disappointing as the dungeons aren't even randomly generated, aside from which specific enemies spawn. So sure, it's fun the first time, but after the second, third, and fourth time, it's just kinda boring. There's little to no meaningful story, and it has about as much content as a Headhunter pack from Borderlands 2. And that's another big problem with DLCs in Wonderlands, is the price. Previous Borderlands DLCs have been $20 each, pretty much universally, whereas the DLC in Wonderlands is $13.49. Well hey, that's cheaper, which is good, right? Actually no, not really. Sure, DLC for Wonderlands is cheaper than most DLC for other games, but you'll remember that I said they have about as much content as a Headhunter pack from Borderlands 2. Considering the fact that each Headhunter pack is $5, then that means that Wonderlands DLC is still wildly overpriced. Luckily enough, you can completely opt out of buying the DLC for Wonderlands, which, unless it gets significantly better, I would strongly recommend. Another really important aspect for the enjoyment of a game is the actual gameplay mechanics. Gameplay is something that this series has been doing a great job of catching up with lately. Gameplay in the Borderlands series, especially with Wonderlands, has improved drastically. There have been so many quality of life improvements made in Wonderlands. There are a couple of changes that were brought over from Borderlands 3 of course, but there are a lot of improvements specific to Wonderlands. Improvements like being able to sell all your junk items without even going into a menu. Same with refilling your health for free without menus. One of the biggest gameplay changes, especially for console players, is that you can farm bosses by traveling to Brighthoof and back. Every installment in this series has gotten so much easier and more fluid to play, so naturally Wonderlands has some of the best gameplay in the franchise. Endgame is a vast majority of what makes a Borderlands game entertaining. Sure, the story of Borderlands 3 takes around 6 to 8 hours to beat. However, doing what I would consider to be beating the endgame takes multiple days and even weeks in some cases. Borderlands has always had amazing endgame activities, with raid bosses, takedowns, trials, and seasonal events. Borderlands 3 had the best endgame activities of the entire series, which is why I thought that Wonderlands would follow in its footsteps and have an amazing endgame. Boy was I wrong. The endgame of Wonderlands is, to say the very least, yikes. Wonderland's endgame is just dull. I did a full video going in depth as to why I don't like the Chaos Chamber, which you can watch right here. However, to recap, the Chaos Chamber is kind of pointless. There's not any reason to do it, and that's all there is. The only endgame activities Wonderlands has is linked to the Chaos Chamber, raid bosses, higher difficulties, and even the DLC is based off the already disappointing Chaos Chambers. Comparing the two games, Borderlands 3 and Wonderlands, Wonderlands has been out for just under 3 months, and in those 3 months we've gotten 2 incredibly disappointing DLCs and a Chaos Chamber. Within 3 months of Borderlands 3, we had 6 trials, 3 slaughter maps, and the newly released Maliwan Takedown, which would go down in history as one of the best endgame activities in the entire franchise. Good endgame content is definitely missing from Wonderlands, and honestly, I haven't even played Wonderlands in a month since this endgame just got so stale for me. Post-launch communication and support is very important in the modern era of video games. With how many issues Borderlands games tend to have at launch, it's pretty normal, for better or for worse, for stuff to get hotfixed and patched for years after the release date. This trend has obviously continued with Wonderlands, but it just doesn't seem as thoughtful as it was with Borderlands 3. Whenever something big got patched in Borderlands 3, there was always a big reason for it. Most hotfix notes came with some form of communication from the developers about what they were working on. And there was also a lot of communication on Twitter and the Gearbox forums about what was going on with Borderlands 3. We haven't seen a lot of that with Wonderlands, and it makes it seem like the developers don't really care about the game. All in all, Wonderlands as a whole is a pretty good game, and it honestly is a hell of a lot of fun to play. Once, twice, or maybe 3 times. And honestly, I consider that getting my money's worth out of the game. Don't get me wrong, I definitely got way more playtime out of Borderlands 2 and 3. Having played through both of them at least 20 times. But Wonderlands is definitely worth $80 Canadian, as long as you go in with realistic expectations. However, with that said, if you can help it, do not buy the DLCs, at least not yet, as those were probably the biggest waste of money in all of Borderlands.